Welcome to Speaking of Jazz with Manny Kellogg, and in association with jazztribe.news. Now let's get started.
Well, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are, jazz lovers. You're listening to Speaking of Jazz with me, Manny Kellogg, and I'm your host. I'm coming to you weekly, and I'm talking about jazz. I have some of the best players, best vocalists around, and the only way you'll know who I have weekly is to tune in. This week, I am very honored and proud to have a bassist extraordinaire. The man is a composer. He's a recording artist. He plays all over the world. And I don't want to prolong anything. The man is very busy, very busy. And I want to go ahead and get started. I'd like to say hello and welcome to the show this week. Speaking of jazz, my good dear friend, Mr. Kent Miller. How you doing, Doc? Let's talk.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Manny. Thanks for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to have a rap session with a colleague of your stature and that has gone through the trenches and the highs and the lows. But yeah, I am busy right now. Like most of us, things were dry for a while and things are slowly picking up, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. Very
good. Well, let me ask you. Well, let's get started. I got some things I want to hit you with, Doc, because I'm curious. I have not really had a chance to sit down and talk with you that much. I've had a chance to sit down and listen to you play, and it's absolutely fantastic, man. Let's get started. Where are you from, and what were some of your influences to really get you into where you are? You want to give us a little background and talk about your history, Doc?
Yes, absolutely. So I actually, like a lot of young kids, boys, got into sports and got into music. And there was no actual musicians in the family, full-time musicians, but my mother's side of the family was raised in playing piano. So I have two siblings, older brother, younger sister. So we, 8, 9, 10, 11, we had to learn how to play piano. And that was my first introduction, but music was always played in the house. My mom was more R&B and Nancy Wilson and things of that nature. My dad was more blues, B.B. King, Bobby Blue Bland. So that was always played, many a morning we woke up with Lucille singing through the house, So, and in fact, that's where I started after I was stopped playing piano. I'll say stop playing, but focus more on a different instrument was guitar. And I went, here again, predominantly my whole neighborhood in St. Louis was sports. All the guys played sports, okay? And it wasn't like a big influence of young musicians. There were some, but it wasn't a lot. And so that, my age, I came through post-doo-wop era, so there were guys more singing on the corners and, schoolyards. And more of the Motown, kind of sound. But what it made, I kind of got into guitar, and then playing with some of the friends that were in the neighborhood who were into music. I eventually switched over to electric bass at that point.
Okay.
Yeah, and so so there was a area once when I was home from school, and I think this is really the major influence on the instrument I play today, which is upright bass. So I was home from school and I was sick that day. And back in those days, just it was 3 TV channels, and it wasn't, all what they have today.
Right, I remember that.
And in the afternoon, they had the Merv Griffin show. I can remember this like yesterday. I think I was in 5th grade, and they had Ray Brown. Didn't know anything about who's who in the zoo and the jazz and all of that, but I did have an ear for appreciation music. So they had Ray step out front of the big band. This is on the Merv Griffin show, if you remember those.
Yes, I do.
5 big bands, and they featured Ray on, I can't remember the tune, but it was some song. And that really set with me from that point forward. And I always wanted to do what he did that day. And 2 or 3 years later, I got an electric bass and I was playing with R&B bands. But by the time I got to high school, I still remembered several, that show. And I was doing summer jobs and working. Eventually, I made enough money by my junior year to buy an upright bass.
Okay, yeah.
I think it was $200, but it was a plywood bass and the strings were about a mile off the fingerboard. And I was like, this guy even how does he do what he does, But that was what really got me into the music. My hearing music around the house. And here again, because I was so predominantly into sports, but still had a love and appreciation for music, I didn't go through the, school bands, junior high band and high school bands and those things of that nature. However, I will say the schools back in those times, and still some today, but predominantly a lot of schools back in there. And I grew up in North St. Louis, so it's the predominantly Black area of St. Louis. And the marching bands was something else. I mean, the discipline that they had and the musicianship was second to none.
Yes, yes.
And my dad was a football coach. He actually eventually was a football coach at Sumner High School. I don't know if you know anything about St. Louis, but a lot of great musicians came out of Sumner. A lot of prominent folks came out of Sumner High School. Dick Gregory, Tina Turner, John
Ike
Higgins,
Turner.
Ike Turner. There's a whole lot of folks came out of Sumner. But I remember now, I probably was about 6 or 7 years old, and my dad would take us to the football games, Sumner games, and this is another area that had an impact. And so we would be sitting on the side of my brother and I, we 7, 8, 9 years old, and the marching band would be set up. I mean, the discipline, sharp as a tack, their colors were maroon and white. The shoes were spick and span white. And I remember the band director, he was like a drill sergeant, And I was, but what got me was the sound of that band, the music, all these influences, having been sitting right there watching the marching band, watching the parades, hearing the music, in the house, whether it was B.B. King or Bobby Bland or whomever, was all part of it. Then, like I said, with the Ray Brown thing, kept me engaged and kept me wanting to, never left me.
Very good. I was looking at your bio, my man, and I noticed that you did some studying with Ron Carter.
Yeah.
Talk about that. How was that?
Well, in later years, I ended up in New York, and before I left St. Louis, I was studying with Wendell Marshall, who was a bassist with Duke Ellington for a number of years, and he was Jimmy Blanton's cousin. And I'll come back, first cousin, I'll come back to that. But when I got to New York, what he told me, get out and soak up everything like a sponge. So it's like kind of going to street university. And so everybody I was engaged with, had gone through some kind of academia, or they had just been playing for a number of years. And one thing led to another. And I went to a set and I introduced myself to Ron Carter and wanted to, get some lessons from him. And we had one, and then time passed. I mean, this guy was so busy. He called me one day, and it was like, I don't know, September. And he said, how about March 13th, And I thought he was joking. I said, March 13th, it's September. So
he's about March 13th next year.
Yeah, he was about March 13th next year. I said, well, yeah, I mean, but he was he was so busy, and he still is. He just turned 85, and they just celebrated his birthday. And but later in years, I was able to catch up with him more regularly, and he was, very disciplined, and he didn't really give you the answer. He liked being challenged with questions, and I would go in with a whole bunch of questions, you know. And he would always say, well, Mr. Miller, you know, you can break the rules. It's okay to break the rules, but you got to know the rules first.
To break them, that's right.
So he'd always give you, if I asked a question, he wouldn't answer it. He'd give me, you know, part of an answer, and then I would have to go back, you know. But it turned out, you know, kind of fill it out and then hit him back with more questions. And but it turned out to be a very, very helpful and meaningful, you know, relationship. And that's another thing he said is always have a teacher, young or old. He said, by the time you leave this planet, you're not going to learn everything.
Right.
I was in my late 60s and I really wanted to learn how to really write with strings. And, you know, so he got somebody. And so it wasn't, by the time I really got with him, I was much more advanced on my instrument, but there were fundamental things. He tells everybody this. I remember Christian McBride on the interview and Marcus Miller on the interview. So they got with Ron McCartney, and Ron, the first thing Ron says, okay, play an F scale. You know, and here these guys have done everything.
Yeah.
Same thing when I walked in, he says, okay, play an F scale for me. So he goes back to, you know, the basic fundamentals just to see. And he's not going to tell you, because he said every style is different. He's not going to, you know, tell you how to play, because you got to determine, you know, what the best way you feel to play. But he will tell you some of the basic rules and some of the, you know, things that he's learned over, you know, 60 some odd years of playing.
Yes.
So.
That's fantastic, man. I've never had the pleasure to even meeting Mr. Carter, but I've heard he was a fantastic person. Like you say, very disciplined, had no room for foolishness at all.
No. I mean, when he had said in an issue one time, he had committed the guy, he was going to, you know, give him a lesson, and he went, he had to go on tour, and he got back, he was overseas, he made special plans to get back and to his place where they're going to have a lesson in the States. And the guy, whoever it was late, you know. Yeah. And his point to the, you know, and I think he cut the, you know, lesson thing off, because he's a very disciplined person.
That's so right. That's what I've heard.
He says, be there at 8:30 a.m. You better be there at 8:30 a.m. You know, you be there before 8:30, you know.
But if you're on time, you're late.
If you're on time, you're late, you know. And like I said, it was such a blessing for me to be able to have time with him. And I was doing it relatively regularly, you know, at one point, but I would go in fully loaded with questions, and no question is too simple. He said, ask the question. It's never too simple. He said, every time I go out on the sets are different. You know, the crowd is different. You know, first set is different from the second set. He said, you can play one song 1,000 times, and every time you play it, it's going to be different.
That's right. That's right.
He's always looking, he said, always search for the right note. He says, you know, a lot of times other instrumentalists think the bass player is just back there just fooling around. And maybe some cases they are, but in his case, he says, you know, I'm directing the soloist. My notes, because the instrument is a foundation.
Right.
You know? And you're not just playing 1, 3, 5, 7. You know, you're playing the right notes at the right point, you know, to boost the soloist. So it's a constant, you know, journey, you know, for him and for us. And that's what he shared with me. So
I have another question while we're in this area. Watching you play, I've noticed that you have your amp up in the air. Is there a specific reason for that, having it in the air versus having it down on the floor to get the resonance from the floor?
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, here again, I got that from Ron as well, because you don't have to play as hard.
Okay.
It's right near your ear. So, I mean, sound is important. So, particularly acoustic, you know, as acoustic instruments, we would prefer playing with no amplification. But if you do that, I mean, obviously everyone in the group has to be sensitive to it. But obviously everybody in the venue are not going to be able to hear it.
Right,
okay?
Right.
So in his point, and once again, to maximize efficiency, and less strain on your muscles. He says, if you have it right by your ear, you can hear it. When it's on the floor, certain tones blend in, and it depends on how the drummer tunes their drums. But if it's on the floor, the floor tom and the bass drum, sometimes you can't hear your note because of how the tuning is with the drum, how the drummer tunes their floor tom or their bass drum. And as they hit those drums and you're hitting a certain note, you really can't distinguish it. It's not clear. And that's why it's important, for him. And that's what I've picked up, and I've noticed a difference. Now, sometimes some drummers say I can't feel it because it's not next to me. And so there's adjustments, usually I have to make sure that the drummer can feel the bass,
Yes, yeah.
Because to your point, if it's sitting on the floor, the resonance, the vibration is coming through the floor, and the drummer, it's easier for the drummer to feel what it is. But for a bassist who's specific on each note and the tone quality, the intonation quality of the note, it's easier to hear, because that's something that Rufus Reid told me as well. He said, you're gonna fight with that your whole life, is intonation. Ron Carter says, between every tune, if it's your gig, between every tune up. So if you watch him on a concert, you go to a club or somewhere, between every tune, he tunes up.
Mm-hmm.
He says, now, in the symphony, they tune up before they play. They tune up between pieces, okay? He said, why can't we do that? I mean, the intonation, if your ear is that sensitive and you're trying to play in tune, and it depends on the type of compositions that you're doing. And if you go to his things, most of his things really require intonation. So if he has Russell Malone playing guitar and he's playing bass and he has Donna Vega playing piano, all string instruments. So, and the way his compositions are written, you can easily hear when something is not in tune.
Okay.
So it's important that, that intonation is there. But that Rufus Reid told me that as well. I used to study with him as well.
Very good. I thank you for that information. I'm going to keep on shooting here. Who are some of the artists that you have worked with and working with now?
Yeah, like I said, many years ago, I moved to New York, and the intent, some of the guys were saying, "Look, man, you ain't ready for New York. New York's going to eat you up." I said, "Well, I know that." I said, "I'm not ready," but I think a lot of the guys that I had surrounded myself in St. Louis. Like every city, a lot of them were older and decided to settle in St. Louis. Now, there were people that like John Hicks, who born in Atlanta, pianist John Hicks, born in Atlanta. Early life moved to LA. His daddy was a preacher, and then he ended up in St. Louis, and then eventually ended up in New York and did many great things. I did play with John, some engagements up in New York, but a lot of the folks that surrounded me in St. Louis were prominent musicians during their era. When I got to New York, there was a gentleman, Dave Burns. Dave was a trumpet player. So now, let me just kind of set this up.
Okay, go take your time, Doc.
Yeah, so when I was in St. Louis, I started playing with George Hudson. Now, you probably have to Google George. George was a territory band. So back in the 40s and 50s, George had a big band. The club in St. Louis, a Plantation. So it was Dizzy, Count Basie's band, all the,
Yeah.
The Plantation was the room. The Riviera was the club. And so George had a band, and many years later, he kept the band. Like a lot of cities, guys would play in these big bands, and they would always keep the bands going, even though the era had changed for big band. And so I got a chance to play with George. Now, I mentioned George Hudson because early in George's band, he had a gentleman named Eddie Randall, and Eddie had a big band, and he was the Blue Devils. He had a small, Blue Devils band.
Yeah.
And Miles being from East St. Louis was part of that band. But that network of George Hudson, Eddie Randall was a big thing. And Clark Terry.
Yeah.
Clark came up, and he was from St. Louis, and he was in George Hudson's band. He talks about, that was one of his major goals. If you ever never read his book, he talks about when he was a little kid in St. Louis. He took a rubber hose and had a little mouthpiece on it, and he was always trying to emulate some of the marching bands and drum and bugle corps. But that being said, I did get a chance. There was a gentleman named David Hines who got me in the band. David was an excellent trumpet player. Unfortunately, he passed early, but he got me in George's band right when I thought that, I was attending this school in St. Louis called St. Louis Art Institute. And even though I didn't feel I was ready, he encouraged me to go ahead and get into this band. So in the band, George's band, all the much older. So if I'm 21, 20, they're like 50, 60, 70, years old. They've been through the thing. But it was a good experience. And from that experience, I, eventually played with a lot of good local musicians in St. Louis. Willie Akins was another gentleman that played around, Freddie Washington. These are all Charlie Fox. Charlie Fox was a pianist who played with Clark Terry. If Clark Terry was here today, he would tell you who his favorite, pianist was. But then when I ended up in New York, a gentleman by the name of, there was two elderly gentlemen. One was Dave Burns. Dave Burns was a trumpet player in Dizzy's band back in the late 40s, early 50s, if you got history on, So Dave, the reason I featured Dave is because he was playing around town, but he gave me a lot of insight, and I go back to Street University. Okay?
Yeah.
He would say, okay, Kent, don't play it this way, play it this way, okay? And there was another gentleman in Brooklyn, his name was Ray Abrams. So he was also, if you go back to the 48, 47 Dizzy Gillespie Big Band, you'll see Ray's name there and Dave's name. And they played with all the guys over the years.
Okay.
And I particularly bring them out because a lot of people don't know their names, but they were right in the thick of it, as you know, some people get the press, others don't, but all are equally qualified.
Right.
And so that's how they were. And they both gave me a lot of insight, a lot of opportunity, which led to other things. Let's see, today there's an alto player, TK Blue, James Wadman, Alan, there's a vibraphonist, Monty Croft. There's a list of folks that I came up in that era of playing with Greg Osby, he was in St. Louis. Who else? Eric Person, another alto player.
Okay.
Eric was playing with, I can't think of the drummer. It'll come back to me. And he got me on a chance to play with the drummer from California. I may have mentioned it to you. I can't think of his name at the moment. Anyway, it'll come back to me. But I got a lot of opportunity to play with a lot of folks.
You talking about Jimmy Higgins?
No, it's Hamp. Not Hamp. Lance Bryan is another tenor player who directs the Hamp's band. Directed Hamp's band before he left. Older gentleman, drummer. He's passed now.
Okay.
But he had a band, and Eric got me a chance. In fact, we did a soundtrack to a movie with him, and and it went real well, which gave me exposure to a lot of other musicians, that I was able to engage and play around, But it did. I ended up, moving out of New York because it's just the expense of raising a family. It just got so busy and so costly, and so I ended up in Maryland. Okay. And so even today, so the musicians around town I mentioned earlier, Antonio Parker, the current group that I've kind of configured together, Benny Russell. Benny, he was in New York. I met him. He was another musician that I played with in New York. There was Nasser Abadeh. I'm playing with him currently now. He has a little trio that we play on Sundays. But Michael Thomas, his quintet, it's been together like maybe 20 years, and done things with him. I might have mentioned TK Blue, Talib Kibwe is a saxophone player. I played with him a long time. Lenny Robinson, drummer. There's a lot of guys around town. I can't think of them all. I'm probably gonna forget some. But like I said, in New York, it was a great experience because I did get a chance to play, with the vocalist Cynthia Scott, played with her, and it was a list of folks, like opportunities I got. So
fantastic, man! You have quite a story to share with us, man. This is probably going to be a good one for you. Out of all of the years of playing and traveling, and I guess being in and off the buses and around, what are some of the most funniest stories that you can share? I know you can't share them all, but the ones that you can share with us, man. Go ahead.
Well, I can tell you one that just comes to mind. We were in Chicago, and this was Mike Thomas's quintet, and we were staying at a place that they put us up. Now in St. Louis, it's north side. In Chicago, it's the south side. So it was a pretty rough area, and so we drove on the lot, and it was more of a motel type situation, and so the guys were like, man, we flew in, rented a car, and we were all loaded in the van. And I said, man, they looking at us coming on the lot. And so, so they said, well, we got to get something new. Let's drop our stuff. I said, look, I'm from the hood. I said, I know this scene. I said, somebody got to stay in the room with all the stuff. Okay. And when you go to sleep tonight, you got to sleep with, one eye open.
Somebody got to stand guard.
Somebody got to stand guard. And so, anyway, the next morning, and it was all kind of craziness going on. It was really a motel type situation, and it was active as could be. We were on the people yelling and running, and all kind of activity. So the tenor player and I, we just slept in our clothes. I said, man, I'm gonna keep my jacket here, my bass next to me, and we're gonna break. So the funny thing was, we in the next one, we get in the van, and the drummer, Frank was out cold. Frank didn't hear nothing. Everybody was falling out laughing. He thought we were making everything up. I said, Frank, you didn't hear none of that? I said, man, it was like World War III out there. And, But then we had there's some other things that took place, but it was that's one that really comes to mind. That was kind of really funny,
I can dig it.
Yeah.
I have been in them situations. I know exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and so we've had some others that I don't want to necessarily share because
we'll stay safe, Doc.
Yeah, we'll stay safe on it.
Well, what we're going to do is go for a little break here, and I'd like to remind our listeners that you are listening to Speaking of Jazz with Manny Kellogg. I'm your host. I come to you weekly with different artists, different vocalists every week. You never know who I'm going to have unless you tune in. And if you'd like to be a guest on the show, just email me at speakingofjazz.guests@gmail.com. That's speakingofjazz.guests@gmail.com. And we'll get you right on the show. But we'd like for you to visit us on all of the podcast platforms, and we hope you tune in. So with that being said, I got more questions to go to my guests with. Welcome back, my man. Let's get back to it. What are some of the current recordings of things or tours that you have playing right now?
So, I mean, obviously everything, is now getting back up to speed. And so right before the pandemic, I had put out some of my own projects with the intent to get on tour so we could do some things. And
right.
Unfortunately, things have had, shut down. My last CD was a feature of bassist Sam Jones. And that did quite well in its circulation. And the first place I'm hiring it and looking at is Japan, because they, as you know, in outside of this country, the arts are, there's a different appreciation. And
absolutely right. Absolutely.
And there's particularly in this genre of music, in that area of the world, they really like music. So I've been in contact with gentleman that right before it happened, the pandemic, he wanted me to come over. He really dug it. And when the pandemic hit, he ordered a lot of CDs and things. He said, let's make this happen. So the first place is there. Now, the others are the more regional festivals that I'm, networking. And some folks, as you know, you got to network, you got to get on the list before, way ahead before the festival takes place.
Right, right.
So some of that is just kind of working with folks that would assist in doing it. Now I'm kind of, be honest with you, I'm kind of doing it myself at this point. I mean, and that's kind of a heavy lift because of all the music writing and listening and practicing and all that's required, trying to do all the managerial stuff, that the administrative stuff,
right.
is pretty tough. But I've made a lot of good headway. I did kind of not focus on in the past year when things were starting to come back. I know people were running out and doing a lot of outside things and virtual things. I didn't really participate in any of that. I was actually writing music for my next project and starting to make a list of, festivals that I want to do. And then there are some local I call them regional mid-Atlantic festivals that really focus on the genre of music that I'm doing. Now, locally here, the Mid-Atlantic is one that I've done in the past. I didn't do this past year, but we'll be speaking to Paul Carr to get on that list. But there's Pennsylvania, there's some in New Jersey. There's one down in Atlanta that somebody mentioned. Those are the regional local ones. But for as European, I mean, there's some musicians that I've met and that they just went over to Sweden, and the CD did well in Sweden, it did well in London, and it did well in Japan. So those are ones that I'm trying to, and here again, you got to monitor how things are happening in the world. It's like, it depends on how you look at it.
Right,
I try
right.
to stay positive. Some say it's glass is half full, some say it's half empty. You got the war. You got, you name it, it's
happening.
It's happening. And but in one instance, it's always happening. You know what I mean? So I kind of, those are the areas that I'm looking at, hopefully within the next 12 months to, at least put a dent and a footprint on some of those opportunities.
Very good. Well, if someone wanted to contact you, would you like to share some information on how they might be able to reach you?
Yeah, I mean, my website is TNEKJazz.com, and TNEK is TNEK. It basically is Kent spelled backwards. So I got one of my daughters said, why are you jazz musicians always spelling things backwards? I said, well, I don't know about everybody else, but it's not the city. It's TNEK Jazz, one word.com. And so you can reach out there and connect with me through the website. And that's probably the easiest way.
Very good. And what is the name of your latest project?
It's TNEK Jazz Quintet, plays the music of Sam Jones.
Okay.
And so, like I said, it was a very good project. And, you know, I have three other, and you go to the website, you'll see these three other projects I did, which is a combination of some originals and some other arrangements of other known compositions. I am contemplating, and during the pandemic, I did start arranging some music on Jackie McLean's life and some of his works.
Okay.
But right now I've finished certain certain pieces. I just kind of put them on the shelf for later. I think I really want to focus on getting the group out on the road and, you know, hitting some of the concerts, playing some of this last CD.
Very good. Very good. Well, I'm getting ready to hit you with a couple of more questions here. I know you're busy. You're on a tight schedule today. What advice can you give some of our up-and-coming young bassists or musicians, vocalists in general, to kind of steer them down the right track, keep them on the right track? Again, you know, we're like trying to be a mentor and help our youngsters that's out there, that's into the music, into the craft like we are. What can you say to keep them right?
Well, I just use what I've gone through, and one is I mentioned that earlier. You know, always have a teacher, always, you know, because you're never going to learn anything, and be open. Whether the teacher's older, younger, doesn't make a difference. Because I studied with Milton Hinton one time, and Milton said, you know, when I came along, I was the next thing. I was picking and slapping, and everybody just thought that was the world of things. He says, then I saw Christian McBride come on, and Christian was doing all what he was doing. You know, he says, that just made me pick up some new things. But I would say is the foundation of anything, understanding, if you're going to say this music, you need to have a baseline of understanding who's who and what was done. You know, I'm not saying you have to be a historian, you know. I'm not saying you have to be a purist, because some people play, I like the quarter note swing.
Yeah.
Some people say, well, you're an insider. And then there are musicians who like outside, but it's still all creative art. And if you're going to do it, I would say to any youngster, study, listen. Okay, because some of these things, a lot of these things you're not going to find in a textbook. You're just
That's
not
right.
going to find it. You just can't. And, you know, if you went to, I go to a Baptist church. You go to this Baptist church and you hear certain songs and hear the feel of it. You're not going to get that in a textbook. Okay.
That's right.
If you sing in a choir and some people sing from the spirit, and it's the same thing in this music. You can't write it down. It's a feel. And
it's a feel.
It's the feel, and you get that from listening to the music. I got 3,000 albums down in my basement. You know, where I listen to, and the musicians, male and female, that created this art form, created it from experiences, and those emotions experienced were feelings, and those feelings came in. So if you're, when I hear as a bassist, you want to be right with the drummer as he's hitting that cymbal, that ride cymbal, and there is a texture in it, in that ride cymbal, and that bass note. And it has to be locked, and you can't read about it. You just can't read about it.
You can't write that. You can't write it.
You can't write that, and So only your ear listening and getting that into your DNA. I think that's the biggest thing I would tell a young bass player. You know, if you're going to play this, and all music has their thing, but we're talking about this area of jazz. And, you know, people often say it's not how much you play, it's what you play.
It's what you play, where you place it.
And where you place it.
Yes.
Where you place it, you know. And a teacher had once told me, Wendell Marshall, who played with Duke Ellington for a long time, he said, when you see that person, if you're playing, you see somebody patting their foot, you play to that person. He said,
That's
the
right.
hall could be filled with people, but if the person's patting their foot, you play to that person.
That's what I do.
And yeah, I know you do. I know you do. And so you don't have them until you see them patting their foot. And once they're patting their foot or bobbing their head, you got them.
You got them.
And that's where it is. And you can't write that down. So all young musicians, I strongly would say, understand a quarter note, understand the feel, okay? And then you got to sync up with the drummer. It's like hand in glove. They got to be together, And if they're not together, everybody's creatively different. You got to find your own, your other mate, if you will, that lines up with you. There's nothing wrong if they're different. You got several people, you never saw Miles Davis and Duke Ellington play together. They were creatively different, enormously talented, but creatively different. Okay?
Yeah.
But with a bass player and a drummer, it's the same thing. You got to find, if the drummer's a real busy drummer, may not be anything wrong with, but may not fit with that quarter note thing that we're talking about. But if once you feel it and experience it, oh my goodness.
Lord have mercy.
Oh,
man, I know what you're talking about.
And they're going to know what you're talking about. People going to say, I don't know what was going on there, but boy, they were swinging.
Hard swinging from limb to limb.
Swinging from limb to limb. That's what you're going for. That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Hey, man, I know you got to go. I got one more. I'm going to shoot from the hip.
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Put on your seatbelt, Doc. What is jazz to you, man?
Wow, what is jazz? Well, okay, so I touched on it certain, but first off, jazz is a term that was given. I won't, get into that whole history of why this art form was called jazz, okay? Because there's a negative history with that naming of this art form. But in the context of what we're talking about, the origin, if you had, because it was an art form created in this country, it was music. Well, let me backstep there. There was an art form in Africa. There was an art form in Europe. And way back at when this country was developing, those influences came together. A lot of books on, origin coming in the Caribbean, origin starting in New Orleans. And like I said, I do a lot of reading and listening, and you could have a whole nother show on just on that history, those facts. But the experience of people during those times started the creating of this. So meaning it is improvised. It is improvised. It's emotions and feelings improvised in a conversation amongst musicians performing. So if you got musicians in there is form, there's melody, there's rhythm, those basic things, but it's a conversation that takes place. Okay. And so when people, to me, they say jazz, And the question is always comes back when you say jazz, what kind of jazz? I mean, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Because there are different genres of music, different genres of jazz, and I kind of hate labels, but in some sense, you want to have a label in order to distinguish. So if you say rock and roll, you say R&B, you say blues, you say jazz, you say smooth jazz. Some jazz is just a repetitive rhythm, okay? And what we're talking about is more than a rhythm. We're talking about a feeling, a conversation that takes place on the bandstand. There's melody, there's structure, there's form. But most important, the improvisation of the communication between each musician. And as a bassist, and I mentioned this earlier, every chorus, every measure, there's a different note.
Okay.
And the note has to mean something. So if I'm playing a C chord and a dominant chord or something, I'm not just playing C, G, B flat. I'm thinking in context of the melody. I'm thinking in context what that soloist just said. There's a statement that's being said, and so you're communicating real time. Now European music, classical music, they play what's rhythm, what is written, and they can't deviate because the composer wrote it a certain way and it's intended to be played the same way. And what we're talking about, this form of jazz is not that. Okay. I'm not putting down any type of music, but for me, the question to me is, what does jazz mean? It means a musical conversation, an improvised conversation, just as we're talking right now. Okay, it is spontaneous with structure, form, and a whole set of rules. Like Ron Carter said, you can break the rules. So if I just started speaking Latin right now, okay, I'm breaking the rules because we're having a conversation in English. But
that's a good one.
But there is structure and form. So people who don't know this music think guys are just up there making noise. And there are rules, there's form, there's structure, there's, all of that. But the most important thing is, and what we talked about earlier, is that feel.
The feel
has to be there. The feel has to be there. And tempo doesn't have anything to do with it. I mean, even if you take something up tempo, the feel still has to be there.
Right.
Funny thing is, a lot of times people who aren't familiar with this music and they hear it and they try to start dancing to it, but they can't find the rhythm. And I know you've seen that. They can't find it because they don't know the feel. They really want it.
They be on 1 in 99.
Or I give you another one, while you're playing and they're enjoying it so much they want to clap along.
Oh, please.
And so you can't look at it or you can't listen to them because they'll mess you up. But right. That's what I'm talking about. It's a conversation. And that's what, people who there was a clip with Duke Ellington once said, some people snap like this and some snap like this, and in what he was talking about is that feel,
mm-hmm.
Some people will clap like this and some clap, and he's talking about that feel. And so you really have to understand, and you get it through listening. All I can say is you got to listen to the music. People who created the music, you get it in your DNA. That's one thing. You got to learn how have command of your instrument, and then you have to have the right musicians around you to be able to have this conversation, willing to listen, because people grow at different levels. They reach a point where they need to do something different. You take Miles, in his different groups, you know, with when he had Wynton Kelly and that group, Paul Chambers. Then he went to, you know, Herbie and Ron and Tony. Then he left that. Then he went to Dave Holland. You know, you reach a level of creativity where you need to mature and go on, but you still got to have the right musicians around you.
Right.
So you can do that. Yeah. That's kind of a long way to say it's all about the feel.
But you know, each time I get down to that question, what is jazz, is presented differently every time.
Right. I'm sure.
And there's not a wrong answer, because again, talk about feel. That's the way they feel it.
Right.
You know, and I can dig what you're saying too, man, because I'm a quarter note man. I love to swing.
Right.
You know?
That's how, you know, that's how I am. I love the quarter note, and you got to learn how to play the quarter note and get the right feel of it.
You can't play the quarter note right there, man, because if you do, it's going to sound like a cadence.
Right.
And it'll be rigid.
Right.
But you got to play that bad boy way back there. So then you got the bing, 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 bing.
Right.
bing.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Exactly. Because some people say you got to know, well, you can play right on it. You can play ahead of it. You can play behind it. And if you don't know what that means, you don't know how to feel of it. You can understand it logically, but you got to be able to understand what that feel is.
Yeah.
If you're going to play ahead of the beat, you're going to play behind the beat, you're going to play on the beat. You know, that's the thing, you know, and of understanding quarter note.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen and jazz lovers, there you have it. Again, we have been listening to bassist, arranger, writer, recording artist, Mr. Kent Miller. And I just want to thank you so much, man, for your time and being able to share with our listeners today. Again, I'm reminding the listeners you're listening to Speaking of Jazz with me, Manny Kellogg, your host, and I'm coming your way each week with somebody different, just like Mr. Kent Miller. And the only way you're going to know who I have is you got to tune in and check me out each week. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, email me at speakingofjazz.guest@gmail.com. That's speakingofjazz.guest@gmail.com. Hey, man, thank you so much for being with me and sharing your time, sharing your stories. And we're going to have a second conversation to pick up on that number 6 question, what is jazz? We're going to pick up on that next time.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're going to turn you loose on that. Man, you have yourself a wonderful time. God bless your heart, man. And I'm going to say this because I know you understand what I'm saying. Keep swinging, brother, and God bless.
Yeah. Thank you, Manny. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for having me.
God bless your heart, man. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too.
We hope you enjoyed the show and thank you for keeping jazz alive. Don't forget to follow us on our social media channels. All the links are in the podcast description.